The shovel bit into frozen earth for the 100th time that morning, and Leander Voss knew every neighbor within 5 miles thought he was digging his family's grave. But when the blizzard of 1873 buried the Dakota Territory under 20 feet of snow and 70-mile-per-hour winds, his children would be the only ones still warm. Before we go further, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this speak to you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. The hole was 8 feet deep, 12 feet wide, and growing deeper with every swing of Leander Voss's shovel. He had been digging for 6 days, carving into the southern face of a low hillside 3 miles west of what would eventually become the town of Hutchinson in the Dakota Territory. It was October 1872, and the earth was still soft enough to work, though frost came earlier each morning. Leander knew he had perhaps 3 more weeks before the ground froze solid. 3 weeks to finish what he had started, or his family would face another winter in the canvas tent that currently served as their home. From the ridge above, Barnabas Reimer sat on his horse and watched. He had ridden over specifically to see what the strange Voss fellow was doing. What he saw made no sense. Leander was digging into a hillside like a badger, piling earth and rock to one side, cutting deeper into the slope with methodical determination. Barnabas had built his own cabin 2 miles east, a proper structure of hewn logs with a peaked roof and a stone chimney. It had taken him and his 2 sons 12 days to complete. It was warm, dry, and looked like a home should look. What Leander was creating looked like a mine shaft or a root cellar, not a place for a family to live. Barnabas urged his horse down the slope. Leander heard him coming but did not stop digging. He was working on the back wall of what would become his home, cutting into clay and packed earth, shaping a vertical face that would support the structure he envisioned. His shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool October air. His hands were calloused and bleeding in places where blisters had formed and torn. He had lost 12 pounds since beginning this project, and his wife Clotilda was worried about him in ways she had not been before. "Voss?" Barnabas called out as he dismounted. "What in God's name are you building?" Leander paused, leaning on his shovel. He was 31 years old, lean and weathered from 2 years on the frontier. His beard was dark and full, and his eyes held the focused intensity of a man who had seen something others had not yet witnessed. "A home," he said simply. Barnabas walked to the edge of the excavation and peered down. "This is a hole. A home sits above ground where decent people can see it." "A home keeps a family alive through winter," Leander replied. "What sits above ground does not matter if what matters is what keeps them warm." Barnabas shook his head. "You are digging your family's grave, Voss. Mark my words. You will bury your wife and children in that hole come spring, frozen solid because you were too stubborn to build a proper cabin." Leander returned to his digging without responding. He had heard variations of this criticism from every neighbor who had passed by. Deacon Pruitt had suggested he was mentally unsound. Ephraim Kurtz had offered to help him build a real cabin before winter arrived. Even Clotilda, who trusted him more than anyone, had asked quietly if he was certain this would work. But Leander was certain. He had seen what traditional cabins could not do. He had felt what happened when winter came to the Dakota Territory with its full frozen fury. And he had learned from a man who knew things that frontier settlers had forgotten or never learned at all. The winter of 1871 had nearly killed them all. Leander remembered every detail with the clarity that trauma brings. They had arrived in the Dakota Territory in September of that year, full of hope and determination. They had purchased 80 acres of prairie land from the territorial office, sight unseen, paying with money Leander had saved from 5 years working in a Cincinnati furniture factory. The land was good, with a creek running through the eastern section and enough timber along the waterway to build a cabin. Leander had built that cabin in 18 days, working alone while Clotilda and the children lived in their wagon. He had followed the methods his father had taught him in Pennsylvania, methods that had served his family for 2 generations. He cut logs from the cottonwoods along the creek, notched them at the corners, stacked them into walls, and chinked the gaps with mud mixed with prairie grass. He built a door from split planks and hung it on leather hinges. He constructed a roof using smaller poles covered with sod. The cabin measured 14 feet by 16 feet with a stone fireplace at one end and a single window covered with oiled paper. It was adequate for autumn. It seemed sturdy enough for winter, but when December arrived and brought temperatures that dropped to 30 below zero, the cabin revealed its fatal flaws. The chinking between logs dried and cracked in the extreme cold, creating gaps that wind howled through. The sod roof, which had seemed thick and insulating, allowed heat to escape upward while cold pressed down from above. The stone fireplace, which Leander had built without proper understanding of draft and heat reflection, consumed enormous amounts of firewood while providing minimal warmth. The single room became a battle between the fire at one end and the killing cold at the other. They burned through Leander's entire winter woodpile by mid-January. He had cut and stacked enough wood to last until March, or so he thought. But keeping the cabin even minimally warm required constant feeding of the fire. Leander spent his days cutting more wood, venturing out into temperatures that froze exposed skin in minutes, hauling dead timber back to the cabin, cutting it into burnable lengths, and feeding it into the fireplace that devoured everything he brought. On January 23, 1872, young Anselm developed a cough that would not stop. The boy was 9 years old and strong, but the constant cold inside the cabin was wearing him down. Clotilde wrapped him in every blanket they owned and kept him near the fire, but the fever came anyway. For 3 days, Anselm burned with fever while his parents watched helplessly. There was no doctor within 50 miles. There was no medicine. There was only the cabin that could not keep them warm and the winter that would not relent. Anselm survived. The fever broke on the 4th day, and the boy slowly recovered. But Leander understood with absolute certainty that they had been fortunate. The cabin had nearly killed his son. Traditional construction, the methods everyone used, the methods everyone trusted, were inadequate for this climate. Matthias Schoen arrived at the Voss homestead in April 1872, traveling alone on horseback with surveying equipment packed on a mule. He was working for the territorial government, mapping property boundaries and establishing section lines for future settlement. He needed a place to camp for 3 nights while he worked the area around Leander's land. Leander offered hospitality, as was customary on the frontier, and Matthias accepted. The surveyor was 60 years old, originally from Bavaria, with a lined face and careful eyes. He had been in America for 30 years, working throughout the northern territories, and he carried knowledge that most settlers lacked. On his second evening at the Voss homestead, while sitting near the fire outside the cabin, Matthias asked a question that changed everything. "How did your family fare this winter?" Leander told him truthfully. He described the cold that penetrated every corner of the cabin, the impossible amount of firewood required, Anselm's near death from fever, and the realization that his construction methods were insufficient. Matthias listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, his expression suggesting he had heard similar stories many times before. When Leander finished, Matthias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "In the old country, in the northern regions where winter is as harsh as here, some people build their homes into the earth." Leander had never heard of such a thing, Matthias explained. In parts of Scandinavia, in Iceland, in certain regions of Central Europe, where wood was scarce and winters were brutal, people had developed methods of construction that used the earth itself as protection. They dug into hillsides or excavated below ground level, creating spaces that were partially or fully underground. They covered these spaces with earth and sod, creating roofs that were thick and insulating. The earth surrounding the dwelling maintained a constant temperature, never as cold as the winter air above, never as hot as summer sun. A small fire could keep such a space comfortable through the worst cold, because the earth prevented heat from escaping. The ground below the frost line stays at about 50 degrees year-round, Matthias explained. If you build underground, you start with 50 degrees. You only need to heat from 50 to 70, not from 30 below zero to 70. You understand the difference? Leander understood immediately. The mathematics were simple. The engineering made perfect sense. But he had never seen such a structure. He did not know how to build one. Matthias spent the next 2 hours sketching in the dirt beside the fire, showing Leander the principles of earth-sheltered construction. He explained drainage systems to prevent water accumulation. He described roof structures that could bear the weight of earth. He detailed ventilation methods that would prevent suffocation while maintaining warmth. He drew cross-sections showing how to angle walls, how to position entrances, how to create living spaces that were dry, warm, and safe despite being underground. "Will people not think this strange?" Leander asked. "A family living in the ground like animals?" Matthias shrugged. "People think many things. Your family will be alive and warm. That is what matters." Leander spent May and June 1872 studying the land around his homestead, looking for the right location to build what Matthias had described. He needed a hillside with good drainage, southern exposure for light and warmth, and soil composition that would be stable but not impossible to excavate. He found the spot 300 yards west of his existing cabin, a gentle slope rising about 15 feet over a distance of 40 feet. The soil was mixed clay and sand, packed hard but workable. A natural shelf of limestone ran beneath the surface at a depth of about 10 feet, providing a solid base. Water would naturally drain away from the slope rather than accumulating. He marked the location using stakes and cord, laying out dimensions that Matthias had suggested. The dwelling would be 16 feet wide and 20 feet deep, extending back into the hillside. The front wall would be partially exposed, rising 6 feet above ground level, with a door and small window. The back wall would be fully underground, cut into the hillside. The side walls would transition from partially exposed at the front to fully buried at the back. The roof would be a gentle arch, strong enough to support 3 feet of earth and sod. Before beginning excavation, Leander spent 2 weeks cutting and hauling timber. He needed logs for the roof structure, planks for the door and window frames, and posts for interior support. He selected straight cottonwood logs, each about 10 inches in diameter and 12 feet long. He cut 30 of them, more than he thought he would need. He also cut smaller poles for roof slats and split planks for finish work. The wood needed time to season, so he stacked it in the sun, knowing it would dry better in summer heat than if he waited until autumn. Clotilda watched these preparations with mixed emotions. She trusted Leander's intelligence and had seen him solve problems before. But the idea of living underground frightened her in ways she could not fully articulate. It seemed unnatural. It seemed dark. It seemed like surrendering something essential about human habitation. But she also remembered Anselm's fever, remembered the desperate cold of the previous winter, and she understood that Leander was not doing this from whim or fancy. He was trying to keep them alive. In late July, Leander began digging. He started at what would be the front of the dwelling, removing topsoil and setting it aside. The sod would be useful later for the roof. He dug down 4 feet, creating a level floor at that depth below the frost line. Then he began cutting back into the hillside, removing earth in careful layers, shaping the back wall and side walls according to the dimensions he had marked. The work was brutal. Dakota summer heat was as extreme as winter cold. Temperatures reached 100 degrees. Barnabas Reimer was not a cruel man by nature, but he found Leander's project irresistibly amusing. He rode over every few days, specifically to watch the progress and to share his observations with other neighbors. By August, Leander's excavation had become a source of entertainment for the entire scattered community. Men would ride miles out of their way to see the hole that Voss was digging, and they would leave shaking their heads, convinced they were witnessing either madness or spectacular foolishness. "He is building a tomb," Barnabas told Deacon Pruitt one Sunday after church services held in Ephraim Kurtz's barn. "Mark my words, come spring, we will be digging those people out of that hole frozen solid, and we will bury them properly in the ground they were so eager to live under." Deacon Pruitt was more charitable but equally skeptical. Perhaps he has reasons we do not understand. We should not mock a man trying to protect his family. "Protect them?" Barnabas laughed. "He is burying them alive. There is no light in that hole. There is no air. Rain will flood it. Snow will collapse whatever roof he thinks he can build over it. This is not protection. This is suicide with extra steps." The criticism reached Leander through multiple channels. Some neighbors told him directly. Others spoke loudly enough when passing by that he could not help but hear. Children from neighboring homesteads would sometimes appear at the edge of his excavation site, staring down into the hole, whispering to each other about the strange man who was digging a grave for his family. Even Ephraim Kurtz, who was generally kind and who had offered genuine help, came by in late August to express concern. "Leander," Ephraim said carefully, "I know you have your reasons, but winter comes in 10 weeks, maybe 12. If this does not work, if this fails, there is no time to build something else. Your family will have no shelter." "This will work," Leander said. He was standing waist-deep in the excavation, covered in dirt and sweat, holding a shovel that he had been swinging for 8 hours that day. "How can you be certain? The Earth maintains constant temperature below frost line, 50 degrees year-round. Mathematics and physics do not lie. Traditional cabins start with outside temperature, which is 30 below in January. My home starts with 50. I only need to add 20 degrees. Traditional cabin needs to add 100 degrees, which requires more wood, which is more likely to fail." Ephraim had no answer for the mathematics, but mathematics were abstract. The hole in the ground was concrete, and it looked like a grave. "I hope you are right," he said finally, "for your family's sake." The mockery intensified as September arrived, and Leander began construction of the actual structure within the excavation. Neighbors saw him placing stones at the base of the back wall, creating a foundation. They saw him erecting vertical posts along the side walls. They saw him constructing a curved framework for the roof using bent saplings and cross-bracing. Nothing about it resembled normal construction. It looked improvised, fragile, desperate. Barnabas brought his 2 sons to watch one afternoon in mid-September. The boys were 14 and 16, old enough to understand construction, and Barnabas wanted them to see what happened when a man ignored established wisdom. "Look carefully, Faut," he told them. "This is what pride and stubbornness create. Remember this when you build your own homes someday. Build above ground like civilized people." The back wall required the most careful engineering because it bore the greatest load and faced the most pressure from the earth behind it. Leander started with drainage, something Matthias had emphasized as critical. He dug a trench along the base of the back wall, extending it 6 inches below the floor level and filling it with rocks and gravel. This trench would collect any water seeping through the earth and channel it toward the sides of the structure, where it would drain away from the dwelling rather than accumulating inside. Above the drainage layer, Leander built the back wall itself, using a combination of stone and timber. He started with flat stones, the largest he could find and move himself, placing them in a tight pattern against the earth he had cut. The stones created a solid barrier that would not rot or shift. Between the stones and the earth behind them, he packed clay mixed with straw. The clay would seal gaps and prevent water infiltration. The straw reinforced the clay, giving it tensile strength that prevented cracking. As the stone wall rose, Leander incorporated horizontal timber beams at 3-foot intervals. These beams extended forward from the back wall toward what would be the front of the dwelling, creating structural members that would eventually support the roof. The beams were notched into vertical posts he had set along the side walls. The entire system interlocked, creating a framework that distributed weight across multiple points, rather than concentrating stress in any single location. The side walls presented a different challenge because they transitioned from fully underground at the back to partially exposed at the front. Leander addressed this by creating walls that were double-layered for the underground portions. The inner layer was timber, vertical posts spaced 2 feet apart with horizontal planks fitted between them. The outer layer was stone and clay, similar to the back wall construction. Between the 2 layers, he left a 6-inch gap that he filled with tightly packed prairie grass. Grass provided insulation and allowed any moisture that did penetrate the outer layer to dry without reaching the interior timber. For the portions of side walls that would be above ground at the front, Leander used hewn logs similar to traditional cabin construction, but with important differences. He selected logs with minimal taper, shaped them carefully so they fit together with gaps of less than half an inch, and sealed those gaps with the same clay-straw mixture he used underground. The result was walls that were far tighter than standard log construction. The front wall was the most visible part of the structure and the most vulnerable to weather and cold. Leander built it using the thickest logs he had cut, each one at least 12 inches in diameter. He stood them vertically rather than stacking them horizontally, sinking the bottom 3 feet of each log into the ground below the floor level and pinning them together at the top with cross beams. This created a front wall that had no horizontal joints for wind to penetrate and no stacked corners that could shift or settle. Into this front wall, Leander framed a door opening and a small window. The door would be 3 feet wide and 6 feet tall, large enough for adults to pass through comfortably, but small enough to minimize heat loss. Clotilde Voss had been raised in a German farming community in Wisconsin, where houses were solid structures with windows that let in abundant light and rooms that felt spacious and clean. Her family had not been wealthy, but their home had been respectable, proper, and above all, normal. What Leander was building looked like none of those things. It looked like a cave with a door. It looked dark and cramped and strange. She understood his reasoning intellectually, but emotionally, the thought of raising Anselm and Sophronia in an underground space filled her with unease she could not shake. In late September, as Leander worked on the roof framework, Clotilde walked out to the construction site to bring him water and bread for his midday meal. She stood at the entrance of what would be their home and looked inside. The space was dim despite the open roof above. The walls were earth and stone. The floor was packed dirt. It smelled of clay and grass and raw earth. She tried to imagine sleeping here, cooking here, teaching the children here, living here through an entire winter. The image would not form in her mind as anything but oppressive. "Leander," she said quietly, "are you certain this will be safe?" He climbed down from the roof framework where he had been working. His hands were cut and calloused. His face was deeply tanned from months working in the sun. He looked thinner than she had ever seen him, worn down by the physical labor and the constant criticism from neighbors. But his eyes were clear and focused. He was not a man consumed by delusion. He was a man working toward a specific goal with absolute determination. "I am certain," he said. "The earth is stable. The structure is sound. We will be warm. But it is so dark. How will the children grow properly without sunlight?" Leander had considered this question. "We will keep the door open during good weather. The window will provide light. We will spend time outside when possible. But Tildy, remember last winter. Remember how cold it was. Remember Anselm's fever. Would you prefer more light and less warmth, or less light and more safety?" She had no answer that satisfied her heart, though her mind understood his logic. "The neighbors think we are mad." The neighbors thought my father was mad when he used a new planting technique that doubled his corn yield. People always think innovation is madness until it works. Then they adopt it and claim they knew it was good all along. "What if you are wrong?" she asked. "What if this does not work and winter comes and we have nothing else?" Leander took her hands. They were rough from farm work, capable hands that had helped him in countless ways over 12 years of marriage. "I have calculated every aspect of this structure. The math is sound. The principles are proven in other cold regions. The only variable is my execution, and I am being as careful as I know how to be. If I am wrong, it will be because I made a mistake in construction, not because the concept is flawed, but I do not believe I am making mistakes." Clotilde wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that his months of brutal labor would result in safety for their family. But doubt lingered like cold air at the bottom of a well, heavy and persistent. The roof was the most critical element of the entire structure. It had to support tremendous weight, 3 feet of earth, and sod plus snow accumulation that could add another 1,000 pounds or more during heavy winter storms. It had to shed water effectively so rain would not pool and seep through. It had to be strong enough that even if someone walked across it, the structure below would not collapse. And it had to accomplish all this using materials Leander could cut and shape himself with basic tools. Matthias had sketched the principle during their conversations in April. A flat roof would fail under the weight of earth. The weight would press downward with nowhere to transfer the force except straight down onto the walls, eventually causing collapse. But an arched roof would convert downward pressure into outward pressure that would be absorbed by the walls and the earth surrounding them. The curve was structurally superior because it distributed force rather than concentrating it. Leander built the arch using a technique he had learned in the furniture factory where he once worked. He selected young cottonwood saplings, each about 3 inches in diameter at the base and 12 feet long. These were green wood, still flexible. He soaked them in the creek for 3 days, making them even more pliable. Then he bent each sapling into an arch, securing the ends at ground level on opposite walls of the structure. The first arch required 2 hours to position correctly. By the 10th arch, he could place one in 20 minutes. He spaced the arches 18 inches apart, running from front to back of the dwelling. When all were in place, he had a skeleton framework that curved gracefully from one side to the other, creating the dome shape that would define the roof. But the saplings alone were not strong enough. They needed reinforcement and connection. Leander added horizontal members, thin poles running perpendicular to the arches, tied at every intersection with cord he had made from twisted grass fibers. The result was a lattice that was rigid and strong, despite being made from relatively thin materials. Over this lattice, Leander laid split planks, each one carefully shaped to follow the curve of the roof. The planks overlapped like shingles, each course covering the gaps in the course below. He secured them with wooden pegs driven through the planks into the arched framework beneath. The planking created a solid surface that would support the weight to come, and it provided a base layer that would prevent earth from sifting through into the living space below. The planking took 2 weeks to complete. Every plank had to be shaped individually. Every peg had to be whittled and driven by hand. Leander's hands bled constantly from splinters and cuts. But when finished, the roof structure was beautiful in its way, a smooth, curved surface that looked almost organic. The layering system that would cover the roof represented the culmination of everything Matthias had taught, and everything Leander had learned through months of obsessive planning. Each layer served a specific purpose, and the order mattered absolutely. Done correctly, the roof would be waterproof, insulating, and stable. Done incorrectly, it would leak, collapse, or fail to provide adequate temperature control. There was no room for error, and no opportunity to fix problems once winter arrived. Leander began with birch bark. He had spent 2 weeks in August stripping bark from birch trees along the creek, selecting pieces that were large and intact. Birch bark was naturally waterproof, flexible, and durable. He laid the bark in overlapping sheets across the entire curved surface of the planked roof, starting at the bottom edge and working upward, so each course overlapped the one below. Water running down the roof would flow over the bark rather than penetrating between pieces. He used pine pitch as adhesive at the overlaps, creating sealed seams. Over the birch bark, he spread a layer of the clay mixture he had developed. the same combination of clay, straw, and sand he had used for chinking and wall sealing. He mixed it to a consistency that was thick but spreadable, then applied it with his hands in a layer about 2 inches thick. This clay layer sealed any gaps the birch bark might have missed, and it provided the first layer of thermal mass. As it dried over the next week, it hardened into a shell that was both waterproof and slightly insulating. The third layer was prairie grass, cut and bundled into thick mats. Leander had harvested the grass in late summer when it was tall and dry. He laid the grass mats in a layer 10 inches thick, overlapping them so no gaps existed. Grass was an excellent insulator, trapping air in the spaces between individual stems. This layer would prevent heat from escaping through the roof while also preventing cold from penetrating downward. The grass also provided cushioning that would help distribute the weight of the final layer. Over the grass came earth, the top soil Leander had carefully set aside when he began excavation months earlier. He spread it in a layer 3 feet thick, using a wheelbarrow he had built specifically for this purpose. Moving that much earth onto the roof required days of brutal labor. Each wheelbarrow load weighed approximately 100 pounds. He made hundreds of trips, pushing the wheelbarrow up a ramp he had constructed, dumping the earth, spreading it evenly, returning for another load. The final layer was sod, thick chunks of prairie grass and root systems cut from areas around the homestead. He laid the sod grass side up, fitting the pieces together. The roots would interlock and grow, creating a living roof that would hold all the layers beneath in place. Ventilation in an earth-sheltered dwelling presented challenges that did not exist in traditional above-ground cabins. A standard cabin had gaps between logs, a loose-fitting door, and often a window that could be opened. Air circulated naturally through these openings, providing fresh oxygen and removing smoke and moisture. An underground dwelling, built specifically to eliminate gaps and seal against the elements, had no such natural ventilation. Without a carefully designed system, the space would become suffocating, filled with smoke from the fire, and dangerous from carbon dioxide accumulation. Leander understood this problem from his conversations with Matthias, but understanding and solving were different challenges. He needed a chimney that would draw smoke efficiently, provide adequate draft for the fire, prevent downdrafts that would blow smoke back into the living space, and somehow accomplish all this while penetrating through 3 feet of earth and sod on the roof. The chimney also needed to bring fresh air into the dwelling to replace the air being consumed by the fire and by human respiration. He began by building the firebox itself, located against the back wall in the corner of the dwelling. He used flat stones, carefully selected for their ability to withstand heat, and built a fireplace that was smaller than what most cabins used. A large firebox would require more wood and produce more heat than necessary in a well-insulated space. Leander's firebox was 2 feet wide, 18 inches deep, and 2 feet tall. It would burn small fires efficiently rather than large fires wastefully. The chimney rose from the firebox in a design Leander had modified from standard construction. Rather than building straight vertical, he created a shelf about 3 feet above the firebox. This smoke shelf served multiple purposes. It caught downdrafts and redirected them upward instead of allowing them to blow smoke into the room. It also created turbulence that helped draw smoke up more efficiently. Above the smoke shelf, the chimney narrowed slightly, increasing the velocity of rising gases and improving draft. The chimney structure itself was built from flat stones mortared with clay. Leander made it narrow, only 8 inches square in cross-section, because a narrow chimney creates better draft than a wide one. The height was critical. The chimney needed to extend above the peak of the earth-covered roof by at least 4 feet to ensure adequate draw and to prevent snow accumulation from blocking the opening. Building a stone structure that rose 10 feet from floor to peak, staying vertical and stable while penetrating through multiple layers of roofing materials, required precision Leander had never attempted before. He built the chimney in stages as he constructed the roof, adding height as each roof layer was completed. The first week of October, 1872, brought cold winds and the smell of snow in the air. Leander had finished the structure 3 days earlier, and now the Voss family stood outside their canvas tent, looking at the dwelling that would either save their lives or become their tomb, depending on whose prediction proved accurate. The entrance was a wooden door set into the front wall, the only visible part of the structure that looked remotely like conventional construction. Above and around it, earth and grass covered everything, creating a low mound that rose perhaps 8 feet at its highest point before sloping down to ground level on all sides. Clotilde held Sophronia's hand. The girl was 7 years old, small for her age, with dark hair like her mother. She stared at the grass-covered mound with wide eyes, trying to understand how a family could live inside a hill. Anselm stood beside his father, 10 years old and still thin from his winter illness. He trusted his father's judgment but felt the strangeness of what they were about to do. "It looks like a giant's grave," Sophronia whispered. "It looks like safety," Leander replied. He opened the door and stepped inside. The family followed. The interior was dim, lit only by light coming through the doorway and the small window set high in the front wall. As their eyes adjusted, they could see the space Leander had created. The room was 16 feet wide and 20 feet deep, with a curved ceiling that rose to 7 feet at the center. The walls were smooth, plastered with clay mixed with fine sand. The floor was packed earth, hard and level. Against the back wall, the stone fireplace waited for its first fire. Along one side, Leander had built a sleeping platform raised off the ground, wide enough for all 4 of them with room to spare. On the other side, a simple table and 2 benches provided space for meals and work. The air smelled of earth and clay and grass. It was cool, but not cold, noticeably warmer than the October wind outside. The space felt solid, substantial, safe in a way their canvas tent had never been. But it also felt strange and unfamiliar. The ceiling pressed down with its weight of earth. The walls seemed to absorb sound, creating a quiet that was almost oppressive. There was a sense of being enclosed that went beyond simple shelter. Clotilde stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, taking in every detail. Her feelings were complicated. The space was larger than she had imagined, better finished, more carefully built. Leander had created something that was genuinely impressive in its construction, but it was still underground. It was still dark. It was still fundamentally different from every home she had ever known. "Can we truly live here?" she asked. Leander walked to the fireplace and began arranging kindling he had brought in earlier. "We will light the fire and see how it draws. We will sleep here tonight and see how it feels. If something is wrong, if something does not work, we still have time to make changes." He struck flint to steel and lit the kindling. The flames caught and grew. Smoke rose into the chimney and vanished upward. No smoke came back into the room. The draft was strong and steady, pulling air up and out exactly as designed. Within minutes, the fire was burning cleanly, and heat began to spread through the small space. November brought snow and cold that tested every homestead in the territory. Temperatures dropped to 10 below zero on several nights. Wind swept across the prairie with nothing to stop it, creating drifts and making exposed travel dangerous. Traditional cabins throughout, the region became battlegrounds between fire and cold, with families huddled near their fireplaces, burning through wood supplies at alarming rates, and still feeling cold draft through gaps in their construction. Inside the Vossi earth shelter, conditions were different in ways that became more apparent with each passing day. Leander had started a fire on the evening they moved in, and he had maintained that fire continuously since, feeding it small amounts of wood every few hours. But the fire he maintained was nothing like the roaring blazes that other families required. His fire was modest, almost delicate, burning perhaps 5 pounds of wood every 12 hours. Yet the interior temperature remained stable at 65 degrees even when outside temperatures dropped to 0 or below. The thermal mass of Earth surrounding the dwelling was performing exactly as Matthias had predicted. The ground below frost line maintained its constant temperature of approximately 50 degrees. The mow, 3 feet of earth, and sod covering the roof insulated so effectively that heat loss upward was minimal. The carefully sealed walls prevented drafts. The small interior volume meant less space to heat. Everything worked together to create an environment that required minimal energy input to maintain comfortable conditions. Clotilde had been skeptical for the first 3 days, waiting for some failure to reveal itself. But as November wore on and the dwelling continued to perform flawlessly, her skepticism transformed into cautious acceptance and then into genuine appreciation. The children were warm. The fire required so little wood that Leander's woodpile, which would have lasted perhaps 6 weeks in their old cabin, would now last the entire winter with wood to spare. The air inside stayed fresh because the chimney drew constantly, pulling in fresh air through small gaps Leander had left around the doorframe specifically for this purpose. By mid-November, other families were struggling. Barnabas Reimer had burned through half his winter wood supply. Ephraim Kurtz was spending 6 hours a day cutting more wood to supplement what he had stored. Deacon Pruitt's family was sleeping in layers of blankets near their fire because the far end of their cabin was too cold to occupy. The pattern was consistent across every traditional dwelling in the area. Word began to spread. Travelers passing through mentioned the strange earth-covered dwelling where a family was living comfortably while their neighbors fought for survival. Some people rode out specifically to see it, skepticism turning to curiosity. Leander welcomed visitors, showing them the construction techniques, explaining the principles of thermal mass and insulation, answering questions about ventilation and moisture control. Barnabas came on November 23rd, ostensibly to borrow a tool, but actually to see for himself whether the stories were true. January 1873 arrived with deceptive calm. The first 2 weeks brought cold but manageable weather, temperatures in the teens during the day, dropping to 0 or slightly below at night. Snow fell intermittently, adding inches to the accumulation, but nothing that suggested unusual danger. Families throughout the territory settled into winter routines, rationing wood supplies, venturing out when necessary, and counting the weeks until spring would release them from cold's grip. Leander maintained his small fire and watched the sky with attention born from 2 winters on the Dakota prairie. He had learned to read weather signs, the subtle changes in wind direction, and cloud formation that preceded major storms. On January 16th, he noticed the wind shifting from northwest to northeast. The temperature rose slightly, reaching 25 degrees by midday when it should have been falling. The clouds took on a particular flat gray appearance that stretched from horizon to horizon without break or variation. That evening, Leander brought extra firewood inside the earth shelter, stacking it along the wall near the fireplace. Clotilde noticed but did not comment. She had learned to trust his instincts about weather. He also brought in additional water, filling every container they owned from the creek before it became inaccessible. He checked the door seal, the window shutter, and the chimney cap that prevented snow from falling directly down into the firebox. "How long?" Clotilde asked as she watched these preparations. 3 days, maybe 4, Leander replied, "and it will be bad." The storm arrived on January 17th at dawn. It began with small flakes falling vertically in still air. Within an hour, the wind picked up, shifting to straight north and increasing in strength until it howled across the prairie with force that shook traditional cabin walls and tore at anything not firmly anchored. The snow thickened, reducing visibility to a few feet. Temperature dropped 20 degrees in 2 hours, plunging to 15 below 0 by noon and continuing to fall. Inside the earth shelter, the Voss family heard the wind as a distant moan, muffled by 3 feet of earth and sod. The temperature inside remained steady. The fire burned calmly. Light from the flames reflected off the clay walls, creating warm shadows. The children sat on the sleeping platform playing a game with carved wooden pieces Leander had made. Clotilde prepared a simple meal of beans and salt pork. The scene was so normal, so peaceful, that it created a strange disconnect with the violence happening outside. By evening of the first day, snow had accumulated 18 inches on level ground and formed drifts 6 feet high wherever obstacles interrupted the wind. The temperature reached 30 below zero. Traditional cabin families burned through entire days' worth of wood in single evenings, fighting desperately to maintain minimally survivable temperatures inside their homes. The storm continued through the night without pause. By morning of January 18th, accumulation exceeded 3 feet on level ground. The blizzard reached its full fury on the second day. Wind speeds exceeded 70 miles per hour, creating conditions where exposed skin would freeze in under 3 minutes. Snow fell so heavily that the boundary between earth and sky disappeared into white chaos. Drifts grew to 12 feet high against any structure that interrupted the wind's path. Traditional cabins throughout the territory groaned under the assault, their log walls flexing with each gust, their roofs bearing snow loads they were never designed to support. Inside Barnabas Reimer's cabin 2 miles east of the Voss homestead, the family fought for survival. The fireplace consumed wood at a rate Barnabas had not thought possible. He fed logs into the flames continuously, yet the temperature inside the cabin hovered barely above freezing. Wind found every gap in the chinking, every imperfection in construction, and poured cold air through with relentless pressure. His wife and 2 sons huddled in blankets near the fire, wearing every piece of clothing they owned. Frost formed on the interior walls, where their breath condensed and froze. By the second evening, Barnabas realized his wood supply would not last. He had cut and stacked what he thought was adequate for winter, but the blizzard was consuming 3 days' worth of wood every 12 hours. Simple mathematics told him he would run out before the storm ended. He wrapped himself in buffalo hide and ventured outside to reach his woodpile, struggling through chest-deep snow for 50 feet that felt like miles. The wind knocked him down twice. The cold penetrated through every layer of clothing. He filled a canvas sling with as much wood as he could carry and fought his way back inside, arriving with ice forming in his beard and his hands numb despite heavy gloves. Ephraim Kurtz faced similar desperation. His cabin's roof was beginning to sag under the snow load. He could see the ridgepole bending, hear the timbers creaking. If the roof failed, snow would pour into the cabin, and survival would become impossible. He spent the second night propping the roof from inside using extra poles, creating a forest of supports that filled the center of the cabin and made movement difficult. His family huddled in the remaining space, listening to the wind and the groaning timbers, wondering if they would survive to see another day. At the Voss earth shelter, the storm was a distant presence. The curved roof shed snow rather than accumulating it. The earth covering distributed weight so effectively that no structural stress developed. The wind that battered exposed cabins passed over the low profile of the earth shelter without finding purchase. Inside, the temperature remained at 68 degrees. Leander's small fire burned steadily, consuming perhaps 8 pounds of wood per day, a fraction of Kia. What other families were burning per hour. The children were warm enough to play. Clotilde cooked meals without worrying about fuel consumption. The family slept comfortably under single blankets rather than piling on every textile they owned. The third day brought the storm's peak intensity. Temperature reached 42 degrees below zero. Wind speeds gusted to 80 miles per hour. Snow accumulated at a rate of 3 inches per hour. Visibility was measured in feet rather than yards. The blizzard had become a phenomenon that old-timers would reference for decades, the standard against which All future storms would be measured. It was weather that killed livestock in minutes, and people in hours if they were caught exposed or inadequately sheltered. Deacon Pruitt's family ran out of firewood on the morning of the third day. He had rationed carefully, burning less than his family needed to stay truly warm, trying to stretch his supply through what he hoped would be the storm's end. But the storm had not ended, and his woodpile was gone. The fire died to coals and then to ash. The temperature inside the cabin dropped rapidly. Within 2 hours, it was below freezing inside. Within 4 hours, water in their buckets had frozen solid. The Pruitt family had no choice but to burn furniture. The deacon took his axe and broke apart the table he had built with his own hands the previous spring. The chairs followed. Then the sleeping platform. The wood was dry and burned quickly, providing heat, but consuming their possessions at a rate that could not be sustained. By evening of the third day, they had burned everything burnable except the structural logs of the cabin itself. The deacon looked at his wife and 3 children and understood with terrible clarity that they might not survive the night. He made a decision born of desperation. He knew where the Voss family lived. He knew that Leander had built something different, something that people said was working when traditional cabins were failing. It was perhaps 3/4 of a mile across open prairie. In the blizzard, it might as well have been 10 miles. But staying in the freezing cabin meant death. Moving meant a chance, however small. The deacon told his family what he intended. He would go to the Voss shelter and bring back help or supplies or at minimum information about how long the storm might last. His wife begged him not to go. His children cried. But he wrapped himself in every layer he could wear, tied a rope around his waist with the other end secured to the cabin door frame, and stepped out into the white chaos. He made it perhaps 200 yards before becoming disoriented. The rope played out behind him, his only connection to the cabin. He could see nothing. The wind knocked him down repeatedly. The cold penetrated through his layers. He stumbled forward, guessing at direction, hoping desperately that he was moving toward the Voss homestead and not away into empty prairie. Inside the earth shelter, Leander heard nothing of the deacon's desperate journey. The family was warm, well-fed, and comfortable. The storm broke on the morning of January 20th. Wind diminished to occasional gusts. Snow tapered to light flakes and then stopped entirely. The sky cleared to pale blue, and sunlight reflected off snow that covered the landscape in drifts ranging from 6 to 15 feet deep. The temperature remained at 20 below zero, cold enough to be dangerous, but no longer lethal with proper preparation. The blizzard had lasted 72 hours and dumped an estimated 4 feet of snow across the Dakota Territory, with drifts that would take weeks to melt. Leander opened the door of the earth shelter for the first time since the storm began. Snow had drifted against the entrance, but only to a depth of perhaps 3 feet, easily cleared. The low profile of the structure had prevented the massive drifts that buried traditional cabin doors. He stepped outside into air so cold it hurt to breathe, and looked across a landscape transformed into something alien and beautiful. Every feature was softened by snow. The few trees were bent under white loads. The prairie was an unbroken white expanse. He also saw something dark against the snow about 50 yards from his door. At first he thought it was a fallen log or a drift shadow. Then the dark shape moved slightly, and Leander realized with shock that it was a person. He ran through the deep snow, struggling with each step, until he reached the figure. It was Barnabas Reimer, curled on his side, covered in frost and snow, barely conscious, but alive. Leander got his arms under Barnabas and lifted him. The man was heavy and unresponsive. Leander half-carried, half-dragged him back to the earth shelter, struggling through snow that was thigh-deep in places. He got Barnabas through the door and laid him on the floor near the fireplace. Clotilde was already bringing blankets. The children stared with wide eyes at the frost-covered man who had appeared from nowhere. Barnabas was in severe condition. His hands and feet were frostbitten. His face was gray. His breathing was shallow. But he was alive, and he was warming in the heat of the earth shelter. Leander removed Barnabas's frozen outer layers carefully, checking for serious frostbite. The man's fingers and toes were white and waxy, clear signs of freezing, but not yet black. There was hope for recovery if warming was done properly. Over the next hour, Barnabas slowly regained consciousness. He was confused at first, unsure where he was or how he had gotten there. Gradually, memory returned. He had left his cabin when his wood ran out, attempting to reach the Voss shelter. He remembered walking through the storm, becoming disoriented, falling repeatedly, and finally collapsing in the snow. He had expected to die there. Spring of 1873 arrived late, with snow lingering into April and the ground remaining frozen well into May. But when the thaw finally came, it brought with it a fundamental change in how settlers in the Dakota Territory thought about shelter and survival. The blizzard had killed 11 people across the region, destroyed or severely damaged dozens of cabins, and depleted wood supplies to the point where families had burned furniture, tools, and anything else combustible to stay alive. Those who survived did so through luck, desperate measures, or by seeking shelter in places built better than their own homes. Barnabas Reimer recovered from his frostbite, losing only the tips of 3 fingers and 2 toes. He spent 6 weeks in the Voss Earth shelter, sharing space with a family he had openly mocked months earlier. During that time, he asked Leander hundreds of questions about the construction: how deep to dig, how to angle the roof, how to seal against water, how to build a chimney that would draw properly, how to calculate the amount of materials needed. Leander answered every question with patience and detail, understanding that pride had nearly cost Barnabas his life, and that humility earned through suffering deserved respect. When the ground thawed enough to work, Barnabas began construction of his own earth-sheltered dwelling. He chose a site near his destroyed cabin, a gentle, south-facing slope similar to what Leander had selected. He followed the methods Leander taught, excavating carefully, building drainage systems, constructing walls that would support earth weight, creating the curved roof framework that was essential to the design. The work took him most of the summer, but by September, he had completed a structure that would protect his family through the next winter and every winter after. Ephraim Kurtz started his own earth shelter in June. His cabin roof had partially collapsed during the blizzard, and he had no desire to rebuild using methods that had failed. He worked alongside Leander for 2 weeks, learning the techniques, and then continued on his own. His construction included innovations Leander had not considered, including a small root cellar dug beneath the main floor for food storage and a secondary ventilation shaft that improved air circulation. The modifications worked well, and Leander incorporated them into his recommendations for others. By autumn of 1873, 7 earth-sheltered dwellings were under construction or completed within 20 miles of the Voss homestead. Each family adapted the basic principles to their specific situations and preferences. Some built larger structures, others added multiple rooms. Some incorporated more window space. Others prioritized storage. But all followed the fundamental approach: dig into the earth, build strong frameworks, cover with multiple insulating layers, and create spaces that worked with the ground's natural temperature rather than fighting against extreme air temperatures. Deacon Pruitt, who had nearly frozen with his family in their traditional cabin, became an advocate for earth-sheltered construction. He used his position of community respect to encourage others to consider the method. He organized a gathering in September where Leander explained the principles to 30 families who had gathered from throughout the territory. Leander Voss lived in his earth shelter for 18 years. He improved it over time, adding a second room in 1876, installing a larger window in 1879, and building a small attached workshop in 1882. The structure never failed him. It remained warm in winter, cool in summer, dry during spring rains, and stable through every storm that crossed the Dakota Territory. His children grew up in that space, learned their lessons there, and eventually left to build their own lives. Anselm moved to Minnesota in 1885. Sophronia married a farmer from Iowa in 1887. Clotilda died in 1889 from pneumonia, a winter illness that even the warm shelter could not prevent. Leander stayed on alone for another year, but the homestead felt empty without her. In 1890, at age 49, he sold his land to a young couple newly arrived from Illinois and moved to live with Sophronia's family. He left behind the earth shelter he had built, and the new owners lived in it for another 30 years before eventually building a frame house nearby and using the earth structure for storage. Leander died in 1897 at age 56, quietly in his daughter's home, surrounded by grandchildren who had never experienced the brutal winters that had defined his early Dakota years. His obituary in the local newspaper made no mention of his innovative construction methods or the lives his knowledge had saved. To those who knew him in his later years, he was simply a quiet man who had once lived on the frontier. But in the earth itself, his legacy remained. By 1900, more than 40 earth-sheltered dwellings existed across the Dakota Territory, with variations of the design spreading into Montana, Minnesota, and Nebraska. Settlers learned from each other, improved techniques, and passed knowledge forward. The basic principles Matthias Schoen had shared with Leander, and which Leander had refined and taught to others, became part of the frontier survival toolkit. Earth-sheltered construction was no longer strange or foolish. It was proven and practical. Modern historians studying frontier architecture often overlook earth-sheltered dwellings because few survived into the era of systematic documentation. Most were eventually abandoned as frame construction became standard and as coal and later oil made heating large above-ground houses economically feasible. But archaeological surveys in the northern plains occasionally discover the remains of these structures, circular or oval depressions with stone foundations and evidence of sophisticated drainage systems, silent testimony to people who understood that survival sometimes required building down rather than up. The blizzard of 1873 remained in regional memory for generations, referenced as the worst winter in Dakota history until the storms of 1888 exceeded it. Those who survived it told stories to children and grandchildren about the cold, the wind, the snow that buried entire homesteads, and the desperate measures people took to stay alive. Among those stories were accounts of families who weathered the storm in unusual shelters, earth-covered homes that performed impossibly well when conventional construction failed. Leander's name faded from those stories over time, as names often do.